Welcome to Backbone Unlimited. My name is Matt Hartsky. In this episode, we're breaking down exactly how to analyze a mule deer basin step by step so you can stop randomly glassing country and start understanding how mature bucks actually use the terrain. Because a lot of deer hunters look at a basin and they only see distance. They might see cliffs or trees, open slopes, maybe a few deer here and there, and they just hope a big buck eventually stands up somewhere. But mature mule deer bucks don't survive by being random. They survive by using terrain with purpose, a lot of purpose. If you're not familiar with who I am, I've been hunting and guiding Western big game for over 34 years, and I've been a professional strength conditioning and nutrition coach for more than 30 years, and I'm here to help you become a more successful and consistent mule deer hunter. Now, the best mule deer hunters I know aren't just good glassers. They know how to identify feeding zones, bedding layers, transition routes, pressure pockets, wind advantages, and escape terrain all before they ever put optics on a buck. And once you understand how to break a basin apart piece by piece like that, you're going to stop feeling overwhelmed by that big country. The basin starts telling you where deer should be, and more importantly, where mature bucks should be. Step number one in breaking down a basin is start big before you zoom in. One of the biggest mistakes I see hunters make is immediately zooming into tiny sections of a basin before understanding the overall structure of the country. Before I even start really glassing, I'm looking at the basin as a whole system. For instance, where's the access? Where are the roads? Where's the trails? Where would most hunters naturally glass from? Where are the easiest walking routes for a hunter? Where's the sun hitting first and last? All of that really matters before deer even enter the conversation because a mature buck survives by avoiding pressure efficiency. So if a basin has easy access on one side, there's a good chance mature deer are probably shifting into terrain that naturally separates them from those hunters. I'm also looking at elevation bands. Early season bucks might still be high near alpine feed, while later season deer might already be shifting lower depending on the weather and pressure. Then I started identifying major terrain features like finger ridges, cliff bands, avalanche chutes, benches, timber strips, rock slides, and those hidden pockets that those mule deer love. You're not looking for deer yet. You're building a framework for where the deer should live. Because if you don't understand the structure of the basin first, you're going to spend all day glassing random country with no real system behind it. Step number two is to identify the feed layer. So once I understand the overall basin, I start identifying where deer are most likely feeding. And this changes depending on the season. Early season mule deer are usually focused on high quality groceries like green alpine vegetation and forbs, burn areas, avalanche chutes, moist north facing pockets, and open feed that is near security cover. Later in the year, deer might shift towards the sage or the bitterbrush, mahogany, sometimes oak brush, or transition areas closer to winter range. But here's the important part of all this. Feed alone doesn't create mature buck country. Feed simply explains why deer are happening to use that basin at all. A lot of hunters glass the greenest, prettiest parts of a basin and wonder why they only see does and small bucks. And that's because mature deer rarely feed where they feel exposed for long periods. So when I identify feed, I'm immediately asking, where's the closest security cover? Where's their closest bedding terrain? How far would a buck have to travel to feel safe during daylight? The best feed in the basin often isn't the best mature buck location. Usually, the mature buck layer is just off the obvious feed where the terrain starts getting broken and brushy or steep and harder to glass. That separation is critical. Step number three is to identify the bedding layer. This is where mature mule deer are really killed or lost because most hunters spend too much time looking at feeding areas and not enough time studying the bedding structure. A mature buck wants several things from a bed. He wants visibility, he wants wind advantage, he wants shade, and he wants escape routes. That usually pushes him into terrain that a lot of hunters either ignore or just can't glass effectively. I start looking for broken terrain terrain like benches hidden below ridges, small folds in the mountain, rock pockets, sparse timber edges, brushy shelves, or tiny cuts that disappear from a distance. Then I think about the wind. Can the buck smell danger below him while visually watching above him? That's classic mature mule deer behavior. A lot of bucks bed where they can monitor multiple threat directions at once. And the biggest thing hunters miss is this: big bucks don't need giant pieces of cover, right? Sometimes all they need is one small terrain fold or a nice rock that hides them from 95% of the basin. That's why patience matters when glassing this bedding country. You're not searching for an entire deer. Sometimes you're just searching for the curve of an antler or a horizontal backline or the flick of an ear inside terrain that looks empty at first glance. Hey, if you're serious about becoming a more consistent mule deer hunter, I built the Mule Deer Hunting series of ebooks to walk you through my entire process step by step. This is a 7-volume system designed specifically for Western hunters pursuing mule deer in real mountain and public land environments. In Volume 1, Foundations and Reality, you're going to learn how to understand how mule deer actually live, the myths that mislead most hunters, and the mindset required for consistent success. In Volume 2, Finding Mule Deer and Understanding Pressure, you're going to learn how mule deer move across the landscape and how hunting pressure changes their behavior. In Volume 3, Terrain, Aspect, and Positioning, you're going to learn how to read mule deer country and position yourself correctly using terrain and wind. In Volume 4, Glassing, Visual Discipline, and Buck Identification, you're going to learn how to find mule deer, glass efficiently, and identify mature bucks. In Volume 5, Early Season and High Country Strategy, you're going to learn how to hunt velvet and early season bucks in alpine terrain. In Volume 6, Rut, Transition, and Late Season Movement, we're going to talk about understanding migration, cold weather movement, and how bucks shift through the season. And in Volume 7, Execution and Decision Stacking, we're going to talk about how to close the distance, execute under pressure, and make disciplined decisions during the stalk. If you want to hunt mule deer with structure instead of guesswork, you can buy them individually, or you can bundle all the volumes together and save 50% off the entire mule deer hunting series of ebooks at backboneunlimited.com. Number 4 is to find the transition zones. Mule deer bucks rarely move randomly between the feed and the bed. Most of them use predictable terrain features that allow them to stay concealed while still moving efficiently. So that's where hunters start separating themselves from people who are just out there glassing the openings. I start looking for side hill routes or shadow lines, sometimes brush seams or shallow cuts, saddles, low spots along ridges, and terrain folds that naturally hide deer movement. A mature buck usually wants to move while exposing himself as little as possible. So that means he often won't walk right down the center of an open basin floor unless conditions force him to. Instead, he's going to use the terrain edges. So one of the biggest mistakes a lot of deer hunters make is only glassing visible country instead of glassing likely movement corridors. And timing here matters too. In the morning, bucks are usually transitioning uphill towards bedding. In the evening, they're often slowly filtering back toward feed while using shadows and terrain to stay hidden. A lot of mature bucks are actually visible for only a few minutes during those transition periods, especially when you're just in one spot trying to glass the whole basin. If you're not already focused on the correct route before movement starts, you're going to miss those deer. That's why understanding transitions is just as important as understanding the bedding area itself. Step number 5 is to separate deer country from the mature buck country. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but this might be the biggest, most important chapter in the entire episode, right? There's a massive difference between finding mule deer and finding mature mule deer. A basin can hold tons of deer and still be terrible mature buck country. Does and younger bucks are usually more tolerant of exposure, so they'll feed longer in open country. They'll bed in more obvious terrain, and they'll use areas with higher visibility and less security. But mature bucks are very different. So that means they usually shift into terrain that's harder to access, harder to glass, or a lot less appealing to a lot of deer hunters, like steeper pockets, broken shale, brushy shelves, hidden benches, dark timber edges, or micro terrain folds. A mature buck doesn't need to leave the basin to disappear. He only needs those small moves into the layer hunters overlook. And honestly, a lot of deer hunters abandon a basin way too early because they saw some deer but didn't see a shooter. Meanwhile, that mature buck, he might be bedded just 300 yards away in terrain that the hunter never carefully picked apart. That's why disciplined glassing matters so much. You have to stop asking where are the deer and start asking where would an old buck survive inside this exact basin. That's a completely different mindset and perspective, right? Step number 6, we want to read pressure before you try to read the deer. Pressure changes everything in mule deer country, right? And one of the biggest mistakes a lot of deer hunters make is evaluating a basin without really evaluating how humans are affecting it. Where are the camps? Where are the trailheads? Where are the glassing knobs everybody uses? Where are the ATV routes? Where do hikers naturally move? Because mature bucks learn those pretty fast. A basin might look incredible on a map, but if hunters constantly skyline the same ridges every morning, mature deer are going to shift accordingly. Sometimes that shift can be subtle. They might only be 400 yards, but into rougher terrain. Other times they completely abandon visible portions of the basin during daylight. So that's why overlooked terrain becomes so valuable. Small, ugly pockets, thick brush strips, tiny side basins, steep folds below cliffs. The pressure often compresses mature deer into those kinds of terrain because hunters mentally eliminate those. And timing matters here too. A basin can hunt completely different on opening weekend compared to 10 days after constant disturbance. The hunters who consistently find mature bucks are usually reading that human behavior just as carefully as the deer behavior, because once pressure enters the equation, that basin completely changes and mature bucks adjust fast. Step number 7, choose the right glassing position. When you're out there glassing, you need to understand that where you glass from matters just as much as what you're glassing. A bad glassing position ruins visibility, it creates glare, it destroys depth perception, and it exposes you to deer before you ever spot them. I usually prefer glassing from the opposite slope whenever possible because it gives me angle into the basin instead of trying to glass straight across flat country. Angle here is everything. I also want the sun working for me, not against me. So early and late light can either expose deer or completely hide them, depending on your position. And one thing I've learned over the years is this: most deer hunters glass the obvious openings first. Meanwhile, mature bucks are often bedded in the ugly little pockets that nobody wants to spend time studying or the hunters save for last. So after I cover the easy terrain very quickly, I'm going to slow way down and I'm going to pick apart the shadows, the brush pockets, the tiny openings near the cliffs, the dark timber edges, the terrain folds just below the ridges. And I'm never going to skyline myself if I can avoid it. A mature buck, he might spot movement from over a mile away. So the goal here isn't just seeing deer. The goal is seeing deer before they know you exist. That changes everything once a stalk actually starts. Step number 8, build a morning and an evening plan because a basin should never be hunted randomly. You should already know what you're trying to accomplish based on the time of day. In the morning, I'm usually focused on heavy transition area movement, right? Bucks returning from feed often expose themselves briefly before they head to bed. That means first light really matters. You need to already be set up and glassing before movement starts. In the dark, waiting on it to get light. Midday, that's completely different. This is when I slow down and I surgically pick apart bedding terrain, the tiny pieces of shade, the rock edges, timber strips, small folds, all the places where deer disappear once the sun hits. This is where patience separates good mule deer hunters from average ones. Evening becomes even more about exit routes and feeding edges. Where are deer likely to emerge first? Which slopes lose sunlight earliest? Which routes let bucks move with minimal exposure? And one of the biggest mistakes hunters make is contaminating the basin during that evening movement. If deer feed into the basin after dark, blowing through the middle of it at sunset can destroy the next morning's hunt, right? So sometimes restraint is the smallest move you can make, or making sure that you're working around it even if it takes you a lot longer to get back to camp. A good basin plan should think beyond one evening. It must protect tomorrow's hunt too. Step number 9, Decide if the basin is actually huntable. So just because you found a mature buck doesn't mean you can kill him. This is where discipline matters. Before I ever start a stalk, I want to evaluate the wind, the thermals, the terrain exposure. Are there going to be shooting lanes? What's my best approach route and escape route? Can I move without skylining myself? Will thermals betray me halfway through the stalk? Can I actually close the distance without exposing myself? Sometimes the answer is no, and forcing bad stalks is one of the fastest ways to blow up an entire basin and ruin it for the next day, week, or month. A lot of hunters get emotional once they spot a good buck. They rush the process because they're excited, their fear of missing out. But mature mule deer punish those rush decisions. Sometimes the very best move is just waiting. Analyze, make sure you've got everything right. Maybe the wind improves later. Maybe the buck feeds into better terrain tomorrow morning. Maybe you need darkness to reposition yourself. A basin isn't just about finding deer. It's about finding opportunities that are realistically executable for you as the hunter. That's a huge difference there. The hunters who consistently kill mature bucks are usually the hunters willing to back out of low percentage situations instead of just forcing them. Patience here kills a lot of mature mule deer. And step number 10, make the final move without blowing it up. Once you've found that buck and decide the basin is actually huntable, the final move becomes all about control. This is where most stalks succeed or fail. The first thing I do is lock onto exact landmarks around the buck's bed. Rocks, dead trees, brush patches, shadows, cliff edges. Because once you start moving, everything changes visually, and it can change pretty darn fast. You don't have to move very far, and all of a sudden things look different. So we've got to slow way down. Most failed stalks happen because hunters move way too aggressively once they get close. Noise increases, movement increases, wind gets ignored, and those mature mule deer bucks are incredibly good at detecting unnatural movement inside their environment, especially once they're bedded. You have to stay mentally calm. Pay attention to every terrain feature between you and the deer. Sometimes the best route isn't the fastest route. It's the route that keeps you hidden the longest. And you also need to think ahead. If the buck stands up unexpectedly, where's my shooting lane? If he escapes, where's he likely headed? If thermals switch mid-stalk, where's my exit? The final approach should feel controlled, not rushed. Because once a mature basin buck knows he's being hunted, the entire game changes, and sometimes you're not going to get a second chance on him. So the biggest mistake I see a lot of deer hunters make in mule deer country is treating a basin like one giant piece of terrain instead of a complete living system, because mature bucks don't use basins randomly. They use feed differently than does. They use bedding differently than young bucks. They react to pressure differently than average deer, and they survive by using terrain layers a lot of hunters never truly analyze. That's why the best mule deer hunters don't just glass harder. They break country down a lot more intelligently. They understand where a buck feeds, where he beds, how he transitions, how pressure affects him, and how terrain protects him before they ever start a stalk. And once you learn how to systematically break down a basin step by step like this, giant country is going to start feeling smaller. You're going to stop hoping so much, and you're going to stop randomly searching, and you start identifying where mature bucks should logically exist inside that landscape, because the basin always tells you a story. The mule deer hunters who consistently find mature mule deer are simply the hunters who've learned how to read it. Now, if you want to go deeper into mule deer movement, pressure patterns, terrain positioning, and structured decision making, that's exactly why I built the Mule Deer Hunting series of ebooks. It's a progressive system designed to help you understand how mule deer actually use country and how to position yourself accordingly. I have a link to those ebooks in the description. And if you want ongoing access to the Team Backbone community, classroom, my full digital vault of mule deer resources, private discussions, and direct communication to me for planning, you can join Team Backbone at backboneunlimited.com underneath our membership tab. Everything we talk about here is connected. Preparation is not a single video, it's a system. Thanks for being here. Until next time, train harder, hunt smarter, and never settle.